Dakota Territory, 1883. While every homesteader rushed to build the cheapest ice house before summer heat arrived, one Norwegian immigrant was still constructing in late February. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Niels Haugen built walls 14 inches thick with double layers and sawdust insulation, not the standard single wall construction with loose straw that everyone else trusted. He spent 3 weeks cutting 18-inch ice blocks and $73 on lumber when others finished for $28 in half the time. Then July arrived. Temperatures climbed to 98 degrees. 105? 115 degrees for 6 straight days, the worst heat wave in territorial history. Standard ice houses failed completely. The Morrison family's 2-year-old daughter fell sick from spoiled milk. The Peterson household lost $23 worth of provisions. Commercial operations shut down entirely. But that fool's ice house? It maintained 34 degrees inside while the world outside became a furnace. 2,700 pounds of ice preserved perfectly when every neighbor had lost everything. What did this Norwegian understand about heat, insulation, and physics that defeated an entire community of experienced frontier builders? And how did his excessive preparation become the difference between life and death when conventional American wisdom crumbled under nature's test? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The sound of Niels Haugen's axe splitting oak planks echoed across the frozen prairie on February 8, 1883, while his American neighbors shook their heads at what they considered backward Norwegian stubbornness. Where typical frontier ice houses used whatever lumber came cheapest, usually single pine walls 4 to 6 inches thick with loose straw stuffed between gaps, Haugen methodically cut 2-inch oak planks for an outer wall and 1-inch pine boards for an interior wall, creating what would become a 14-inch cavity between them. Samuel Morrison, watching from his own property line, calculated that the Norwegian was using $47 worth of lumber, enough to build 2 standard ice houses with money left over for spring seed. The mockery began in earnest when Haugen spent an entire day hand-digging a foundation 18 inches deep, lining it with gravel, and installing clay drainage tiles that he'd ordered special from the Pottery Works in Fargo. Anna Peterson, whose family's simple straw-lined pit had worked adequately for 3 summers, called it Norwegian stubbornness taken to foolish extremes. Her husband Lars agreed, pointing out that their own ice storage, a basic excavation covered with pine boards and packed with prairie grass, cost them less than $18 and kept their butter cold through August. But Haugen continued with methodical precision that spoke to generations of Valdres Valley winters, where families who miscalculated insulation froze to death before spring thaw. He arranged for 847 cubic feet of sawdust from Hendrick's Mill, paying cash money for what other homesteaders considered waste material. The mill workers thought him eccentric for requesting sawdust be kept dry under tarps rather than dumped in the usual pile behind the building, but his cash spoke louder than their curiosity. The technical specifications that emerged from Haugen's construction defied every convention of frontier building economy. His foundation measured 12 feet by 16 feet, larger than most homesteaders' root cellars, with walls that would ultimately stand 8 feet high. The double wall system created an insulation chamber that required precise measurement and careful packing. Each shovelful of sawdust was tamped into place, creating thousands of tiny air pockets that would trap heat like a blanket made of blocked air molecules. Edgar Walsh, who ran the territory's only commercial ice distribution business, made pointed jokes at Henderson's General Store about the Norwegian building a house for ice to live in forever. Walsh's own commercial ice shed used standard single-wall construction with loose straw insulation, a method he'd successfully employed in Illinois before moving west. His calculations showed that elaborate construction eliminated profit margins in competitive frontier markets, and he publicly dismissed Haugen's approach as economically impractical for commercial applications. The community's response grew more pointed as February stretched into March and Haugen's project continued. Where neighbors completed their ice storage in 3 to 5 days, the Norwegian had been working for 3 weeks. Dr. Harold Benchley, the university agricultural inspector making his territorial rounds, stopped to observe the construction and found himself drawn into lengthy conversations with Haugen about thermal dynamics and heat transfer principles. The Norwegian explained his reasoning with the patience of someone who understood that survival depended on precision rather than speed. Haugen's 14-year-old son Eric served as both assistant and student, learning to calculate heat transfer rates using traditional Norwegian measurement methods his grandfather had taught in Valdres. The boy asked why American methods didn't work, prompting his father's careful explanation. They work until they don't. Heat is like water. It flows toward cold. One wall is like a single fence against a flooding river. Two walls with dead air between are like building the second fence on a hill. The water must climb much higher. The physics behind Haugen's method became clear through his patient instruction. Single walls conducted heat directly to stored ice. Straw insulation compressed under its own weight and allowed air circulation that carried heat directly to cooling surfaces. Haugen's sawdust, packed between double walls, created what modern engineers would recognize as thermal layering, thousands of tiny insulation cells that forced heat transfer to slow dramatically. As construction neared completion in early March, the contrast with neighboring ice houses became stark. Morrison's structure measured 8 feet by 10 feet with single pine walls and loose straw insulation. Peterson's family had excavated a simple pit lined with prairie grass. Walsh's commercial operation relied on a modified barn with standard frame construction. All followed accepted frontier wisdom that prioritized speed and economy over elaborate preparation. Haugen's finished ice house stood as a monument to what neighbors considered excessive preparation. The double-wall construction required precise spacing maintained by wooden cross beams every 3 feet. Sawdust insulation filled the cavity completely, packed tight enough to prevent settling but loose enough to maintain insulating air pockets. The roof used double-layer construction with a 6-inch sawdust barrier, while the foundation's gravel bed and drainage tiles prevented ground moisture from compromising the structure's thermal efficiency. The final accounting revealed the full extent of what neighbors considered Norwegian overcaution. Total construction cost reached $73 compared to the $18 to $28 neighbors had spent. Construction time stretched to 3 weeks versus the typical 3 to 5 days. Lumber usage exceeded normal requirements by 300%. The structure's capacity, at 2,847 pounds of ice storage, matched commercial operations rather than typical family needs. Yet Haugen approached the completion with quiet satisfaction that spoke to generations of survival knowledge. His ice house would hold Missouri River ice cut in 18-inch blocks, each separated by 2-inch layers of sawdust, in a grid system that prevented solid stacking and maintained insulation throughout the storage mass. The method defied American frontier logic, but embodied Norwegian understanding that extreme environments demanded proven techniques rather than hopeful improvisation. As March snow melted and early spring temperatures began their climb toward summer heat, the community's ice houses stood ready for testing. Standard frontier construction faced its first challenge, while Haugen's fortress of frozen water waited to prove whether traditional knowledge could triumph over accepted American wisdom when nature delivered its harshest judgment. April temperatures climbed faster than anyone expected in 1883, reaching 78 degrees by May 15th, when typical highs stayed near 65 degrees throughout the territory's recorded history. Miss Catherine Reed, the school teacher responsible for maintaining weather documentation, noted the unusual pattern in her daily measurements and began recording temperature readings 3 times daily instead of her standard morning observation. Her methodical records would later prove crucial for understanding the unprecedented nature of what was approaching. The first cracks in conventional frontier wisdom appeared as spring warmth penetrated the various ice storage structures around Cass County. Samuel Morrison discovered puddles forming around his ice house foundation by May 20th, indicating daily losses of 12 to 15 pounds from his original storage. Anna Peterson found similar evidence at her family's straw-lined pit, where ice blocks showed visible melting on the south-facing side, and daily losses reached 18 to 22 pounds. Both families began rationing their ice usage, saving it for essential food preservation rather than the liberal applications they'd enjoyed during cooler springs. Eric Haugen, meanwhile, conducted daily measurements using his father's Norwegian thermometer and documented ice loss rates that defied the pattern emerging throughout their community. The Haugen Ice House showed daily losses of only 3 to 4 pounds, a preservation rate that seemed impossible given the warming temperatures. More significantly, interior temperature readings remained constant at 32 to 34 degrees, while neighboring structures fluctuated between 38 and 45 degrees as outside air heated their inadequately insulated walls. The technical explanation emerged through careful observation and measurement. Standard ice houses conducted heat directly through single walls to stored ice, creating thermal bridges that carried warmth from exterior surfaces to interior cooling surfaces. Straw insulation, which appeared adequate during construction, compressed under its own weight and created air gaps that allowed circulation patterns to develop. Warm air entered through these gaps, rose to the roof where it gained additional heat, then descended to transfer that heat directly to ice storage areas. Niels Haugen's double wall system functioned as intended, forcing heat to travel through 2 inches of oak, then 14 inches of sawdust trapped air, then 1 inch of pine before reaching stored ice. The sawdust created thousands of tiny air pockets that trapped heat like individual insulation cells, each one blocking thermal transfer and slowing the movement of exterior warmth toward interior cooling surfaces. The result was a thermal obstacle course that required heat to overcome multiple barriers rather than flowing freely through single-wall construction. By late May, the preservation differences became obvious to careful observers. The Haugen family used ice liberally for food preservation and comfort, with Eric bringing ice-cold buttermilk to field crews working under increasingly intense sun. Other families began careful rationing as their supplies dwindled faster than expected. Morrison privately worried about his family's situation, calculating that his remaining ice might not last through July if current loss rates continued. His public jokes about the Norwegian running out just like the rest of us masked growing concern about his own inadequate preparation. Dr. Harold Benchley returned to the area in late May as part of his university extension duties and immediately recognized the significance of what was occurring. His temperature measurements confirmed Eric's observations. The Haugen Ice House maintained consistent interior temperatures, while neighboring structures showed increasing thermal instability. Benchley's microscopic examination of insulation materials revealed the critical difference between sawdust and straw. Sawdust particles created insulation pockets measuring 0.2 to 0.8 of a millimeter in diameter. Straw created gaps 5 to 15 millimeters wide, 25 times larger spaces that allowed heat movement rather than blocking it. Weather patterns throughout May showed ominous signs that old-timers like Jacob Steenerson recognized from decades of frontier experience. Steenerson had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1873 and survived 6 harsh winters through careful attention to natural indicators. He warned neighbors that the early heat and unusual wind patterns suggested a scorcher summer coming, advice that most dismissed as old man pessimism, but that Haugen took seriously based on his own understanding of natural cycles. The Farmer's Almanac, arriving by rail in late May, confirmed Steenerson's predictions with forecasts of excessive heat and drought for the summer months. Miss Reed's meteorological record showed May 1883 averaging 7.3 degrees warmer than the previous 5-year average, a significant deviation that suggested broader climate disruption. Her systematic documentation provided crucial context for understanding that the approaching summer would test ice preservation methods beyond normal parameters. Commercial operations began showing stress as temperatures continued climbing. Edgar Walsh's ice distribution business faced daily losses that threatened profit margins, with his standard warehouse construction proving inadequate for the sustained heat. Walsh quietly began investigating alternative preservation methods while publicly maintaining confidence in established techniques. His calculations showed that switching to elaborate construction would eliminate competitive pricing, but continuing losses might eliminate his business entirely. The psychological tension increased as May ended, and June temperatures began setting records. Families accustomed to abundant ice preservation faced the prospect of summer months without adequate cooling for dairy products, medicines, and food storage. The stakes were rising beyond mere convenience toward questions of health and survival, particularly for families with young children who depended on preserved milk and cooled medications. Haugen's vindication remained incomplete, but increasingly obvious to careful observers. His ice house continued performing as designed, while conventional methods showed accelerating failure rates. The Norwegians' understanding of thermal dynamics, dismissed as overcautious European tradition, was proving precisely calibrated for American frontier extremes. The real test, however, lay ahead as summer temperatures prepared to deliver their harshest judgment on the competing approaches to ice preservation and the survival knowledge they represented. July 4th, 1883, brought temperatures that shattered every record Miss Catherine Reed had documented since arriving in Dakota Territory. Her thermometer registered 98 degrees by mid-afternoon, prompting her to take additional readings that confirmed the unprecedented heat was no brief spike, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. July 8th saw temperatures climb to 105 degrees. July 12th brought 111 degrees. By July 15th, the mercury held steady at 115 degrees and remained there for 6 consecutive days, creating what territorial weather records would later classify as the worst heat wave in Dakota's documented history. The catastrophic failures began immediately and spread with devastating speed across Cass County's ice storage systems. Samuel Morrison's ice house, which had shown concerning signs throughout May and June, collapsed completely as a preservation system by July 10th. His final 127 pounds of ice melted entirely within 48 hours as interior temperatures soared beyond 60 degrees. Morrison stood in his empty structure on July 12th, staring at puddles and wet sawdust that represented his family's lost food security and wondering how he had so badly miscalculated the requirements for frontier survival. Anna Peterson's family abandoned their straw-lined pit on July 8th, when Eric Hossen's measurements showed interior temperatures reaching 67 degrees, making ice preservation impossible and food storage dangerous. The Peterson household faced immediate crisis as their remaining dairy products spoiled within hours of losing cooling capacity. Lars Peterson calculated they had wasted $23 worth of provisions, money they could not afford to lose, and food they desperately needed for summer survival. Edgar Walsh's commercial ice distribution business shut down operations entirely on July 13th after losing more than 200 pounds daily for 3 consecutive days. His standard warehouse construction, adequate for normal frontier conditions, proved catastrophically inadequate when exterior temperatures exceeded 110 degrees. Walsh privately admitted to Dr. Benchley that his business faced bankruptcy unless temperatures dropped immediately. A Grossi, meteorological rescue that seemed increasingly unlikely as the heat wave intensified rather than breaking. The human cost mounted with terrifying speed as families lost their primary means of food preservation during the territory's most dangerous heat. Morrison's 2-year-old daughter Mary began showing signs of milk poisoning from dairy products that spoiled despite her parents' desperate attempts to keep them cool in their failed ice house. The child's fever and digestive distress forced Morrison to ride 12 miles to fetch Dr. Benchley, who confirmed that contaminated milk posed life-threatening risks to infants during extreme heat when dehydration could kill within hours. The Hendricks family faced similar crisis when their baby Thomas developed severe diarrhea from spoiled milk, forcing them to attempt dangerous substitutions with goat milk and well water that might contain additional contaminants. Mrs. Hendricks, experienced with frontier childcare but unprepared for complete loss of food preservation, watched her infant lose weight daily and feared the approaching night when fever might climb beyond her ability to control through wet cloths and desperate prayers. Throughout the community, families resorted to increasingly desperate measures as conventional food preservation methods collapsed under sustained heat. The Peterson household attempted to salt cure all remaining meat, a technique that required experience they lacked and salt they could barely afford. Other families tried smoking meat in structures that became ovens themselves, creating fire hazards that threatened entire homesteads during drought conditions that had left prairie grass dry as tinder. Meanwhile, at the Haugen farm, Eric's daily measurements documented what appeared impossible to neighboring families facing starvation and illness. Despite exterior temperatures exceeding 115 degrees, the Norwegian ice house maintained interior conditions between 33 and 35 degrees. Daily ice loss measured only 4 to 6 pounds, rates lower than typical April preservation in neighboring structures during normal weather. The technical achievements seemed to defy physical laws that governed heat transfer, yet Eric's careful measurements confirmed the impossible preservation day after day. The Norwegian family's ice house functioned exactly as Niels Haugen had designed it, demonstrating thermal engineering principles that most frontier builders had never encountered. The double wall construction created what modern engineers recognize as thermal layering, forcing heat to overcome multiple barriers rather than flowing directly to stored ice. Heat striking the outer oak wall conducted slowly through 2 inches of dense wood, then faced 14 inches of sawdust. Trapped air containing thousands of individual insulation cells, each one blocking thermal transfer and slowing heat movement toward interior surfaces. The sawdust's superior insulating properties became dramatically apparent under extreme conditions, where straw created large gaps that allowed air circulation and heat transfer. Sawdust particles formed tiny pockets that trapped air and prevented thermal movement. Under Dr. Benchley's microscopic examination, the difference was measurable and decisive. Heat moved freely through straw's large air spaces, but became trapped in sawdust's microscopic cells, creating insulation that functioned like thousands of tiny barriers working together to block thermal transfer. The psychological impact of the Haugen family's continued ice preservation created tension throughout the community, as neighbors watched their own children fall ill while the Norwegian family maintained abundant cooling. Eric brought ice-cold buttermilk to field crews, preventing heat stroke among workers who might otherwise collapse under the brutal sun. The family preserved dairy products that kept their own children healthy, while neighboring families faced the daily terror of spoiled milk and contaminated food. The stark comparison became undeniable as the heat wave entered its second week. Every ice house within 20 miles had failed completely except one. Conventional frontier wisdom, trusted by experienced homesteaders and commercial operators alike, proved catastrophically inadequate when nature delivered conditions beyond normal parameters. The Norwegians' excessive preparation, mocked for months as wasteful European overcaution, emerged as the only successful response to survival conditions that conventional American methods could not handle. The community faced a reckoning that would force them to acknowledge that traditional knowledge, dismissed as immigrant superstition, contained survival wisdom that their adopted frontier methods lacked entirely. As the heat wave entered its second week on July 20th, Cass County faced what Dr. Harold Benchley would later document as a public health emergency unprecedented in territorial history. With refrigeration systems collapsed throughout the region, spoiled food threatened outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery that could devastate isolated homesteading communities already struggling with extreme temperatures and drought conditions. The medical implications extended beyond individual families to encompass entire settlements, where contaminated water and spoiled provisions could trigger epidemic diseases that frontier medical resources could not adequately treat. Samuel Morrison approached the Haugen farm on July 22nd, his pride abandoned in the face of his daughter's worsening condition. Mary's fever had climbed dangerously high, while her digestive distress from contaminated milk showed no signs of improvement despite Dr. Benchley's treatments. Morrison found Niels Haugen working in his garden during the early morning hours before the day's heat became unbearable, and the conversation that followed would mark the community's complete reversal regarding Norwegian building methods. Niels, Morrison said, removing his hat in a gesture that acknowledged his previous mockery, "My Mary is sick from bad milk. Can you spare some ice?" The Norwegians' response embodied generations of Scandinavian community values that prioritized collective survival over individual profit. "Take what you need," Haugen replied without hesitation. "No payment required." His refusal to capitalize on his neighbor's desperation reflected traditional Norwegian principles, where community survival during crisis took precedence over economic advantage. Within hours, Morrison was carrying 20 pounds of perfectly preserved ice back to his family, along with cold buttermilk that would provide his daughter with safe nutrition and help reduce her dangerous fever. Anna Peterson followed Morrison's example that same afternoon, swallowing her pride and acknowledging the costly error in judgment that had endangered her own family. "I called you foolish, Niels," she admitted. "I was wrong about everything. Will you sell me ice to save what food we have left?" Peterson's public reversal carried particular weight because her initial criticism had been among the most vocal, making her acknowledgement of Haugen's superior methods a powerful validation for Norwegian techniques throughout the community. The Haugen Ice House became the territory's sole source of food preservation during the crisis, supporting not just the Norwegian family, but multiple households whose survival depended on access to functional cooling. Eric Haugen documented the daily distribution in his careful records. 20 pounds to the Morrison family, 15 pounds to the Petersons, 12 pounds to the Hendricks household for baby Thomas's medicinal needs, and smaller amounts to other families facing food spoilage emergencies. The structure that had been mocked as excessive now served as the community's lifeline against starvation and disease. Dr. Benchley arrived from the University of Minnesota on July 23rd to investigate reports of impossible ice preservation that defied accepted principles of thermal dynamics. His scientific instruments confirmed what seemed impossible to frontier residents accustomed to conventional preservation methods. The Haugen Ice House maintained a constant 34-degree interior temperature while exterior air reached 115 degrees, creating an 81-degree temperature differential that contradicted everything Benchley understood about heat transfer in frontier construction. The scientific measurements revealed the stunning scope of Haugen's technical achievement. Original ice inventory from February installation measured 2,847 pounds. Remaining inventory on July 25th, after 5 months of storage, including the worst heat wave in territorial history, weighed 2,738 pounds. Total loss amounted to only 109 pounds over 154 days, averaging 0.7 of a pound daily. Standard icehouse loss rates during the same period ranged from 15 to 25 pounds daily, making Haugen's preservation rate appear impossible to observers unfamiliar with advanced thermal engineering principles. Benchley's documentation process revealed the physics behind what neighbors considered miraculous preservation. The double-wall sawdust insulation system created a heat transfer coefficient of 0.12 BTU per hour per degree per square foot, 4 times more efficient than standard frontier construction. For 6 consecutive days, exterior temperatures exceeded 110 degrees, while interior temperatures never rose above 35 degrees, demonstrating thermal isolation that rivaled commercial refrigeration systems available in eastern cities. The community's transformation accelerated as word spread throughout Cass County about the Norwegians' vindication. Families who had mocked Haugen's methods now gathered at his farm, seeking both immediate ice and long-term construction advice for building their own preservation systems. The knowledge transfer began immediately as Haugen explained thermodynamics principles using practical language that frontier families could understand and apply. Heat flows like water toward cold places, he taught groups of neighbors. Single walls give heat an easy path to your ice. Double walls with dead air make heat work much harder to reach what you want to keep cold. The measurable impact on community health became apparent within days of ice distribution beginning. Morrison's daughter Mary recovered completely once she gained access to preserved milk and ice chips for fever reduction. Baby Thomas Hendricks showed immediate improvement when his parents could provide safe dairy products and chilled water for hydration. Dr. Benchley documented that infant mortality risk from dairy contamination dropped to 0 among families with access to Haugen ice, while neighboring communities without preservation systems continued reporting heat-related deaths among children and elderly residents. The economic implications proved equally dramatic as families calculated the cost of Haugen's superior methods against the value of preserved food and prevented illness. Morrison estimated that access to 20 pounds of ice saved $40 worth of provisions and prevented medical expenses that could have bankrupted his family. The Peterson household calculated similar savings while acknowledging that their initial criticism had nearly cost them everything during the crisis. Edgar Walsh's commercial operation provided the starkest validation of Haugen's approach when the businessman approached the Norwegian about purchasing construction plans for rebuilding his failed warehouse. Walsh calculated that adopting double-wall sawdust insulation would increase construction costs by 280%, but improve preservation efficiency by over 300%, creating profit margins that could sustain his business through future extreme weather events that conventional methods could not handle. August brought cooler temperatures and the beginning of a transformation that would reshape building practices throughout the upper Great Plains for generations. As the killing heat subsided, neighbors who had mocked Niels Haugen's methods now gathered regularly at his farm for construction lessons that combined Norwegian thermal engineering with American materials and frontier economics. The teaching sessions occurred during evening hours when temperatures dropped sufficiently for outdoor work, with Haugen demonstrating sawdust packing techniques, double-wall spacing methods, and drainage systems that prevented moisture compromise of insulation barriers. Samuel Morrison became Haugen's most dedicated student, spending his savings on $71 worth of lumber to rebuild his ice house using Norwegian double-wall methods. Morrison's reconstruction process served as a community demonstration project where neighbors could observe proper techniques firsthand. Hogan guided Morrison through each step, explaining thermal bridging prevention, insulation density requirements, and foundation drainage that would protect the structure through multiple seasonal cycles. Morrison's willingness to publicly acknowledge his previous errors and adopt foreign techniques provided crucial social validation for other families considering similar investments. The technical knowledge transfer occurred through practical demonstration rather than theoretical instruction, reflecting Haugen's understanding that frontier families learn best through hands-on experience. He showed Anna Peterson how sawdust particle size affected insulation efficiency, demonstrating that fine particles created better thermal barriers than coarse material, but required careful moisture management to prevent settling and compression. Peterson's adoption of sawdust insulation in her rebuilt storage pit resulted in 73% reduction in ice loss compared to her previous straw-based system. Edgar Walsh's commercial conversion provided the most dramatic example of Norwegian methods scaling to business operations. Walsh invested in complete reconstruction of his warehouse using double-wall sawdust insulation, spending nearly 3 times his original construction budget, but gaining preservation capabilities that transformed his business model. His new facility maintained consistent interior temperatures through summer heat that had previously destroyed his inventory, allowing him to offer guaranteed preservation services that commanded premium pricing throughout the territory. Dr. Benchley documented the spreading adoption of Norwegian techniques through systematic measurement and analysis that would establish scientific credibility for traditional Scandinavian methods. His published research in the University of Minnesota Extension Bulletin credited traditional Scandinavian thermal engineering superior to conventional American frontier construction, and provided detailed specifications for double-wall insulation systems adapted to Great Plains materials and climate conditions. Benchley's scientific validation transformed Norwegian techniques from immigrant tradition to documented best practice recommended by territorial agricultural authorities. By spring 1884, 12 families within 30 miles had constructed ice houses using Haugen's double-wall sawdust methods. The construction boom created demand for sawdust that transformed it from waste material to valuable commodity, with Hendricks Mill establishing regular production schedules to supply insulation material for Norwegian-style construction throughout Cass County. The economic ripple effects extended beyond individual families to encompass entire supply chains adapted to support superior preservation methods. Eric Hogan, now 15 years old, emerged as the primary teacher for younger generation adoption of Norwegian techniques. His bilingual abilities and mathematical skills made him ideal for explaining thermodynamics principles to American farm children whose parents were converting to Scandinavian methods. Eric's teaching sessions at the schoolhouse, supervised by Miss Catherine Reed, created systematic knowledge transfer that ensured proper technique implementation rather than superficial imitation of Norwegian construction appearance. The summer of 1884 provided the first large-scale test of community-wide adoption of Norwegian ice preservation methods. Cass County Agricultural Inspector documented unprecedented success rates among families using double-wall sawdust insulation systems. Infant mortality from dairy spoilage dropped 67% compared to previous years. Food preservation costs per household decreased 52% despite higher construction investments. Ice house construction costs increased 280%. But preservation efficiency improved 340%, creating net economic benefits that justified the additional investment. The knowledge spread beyond immediate neighbors to encompass Norwegian communities throughout Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas through kinship networks and church connections that facilitated technical information exchange. Letters describing Hogan's success, reached Scandinavian settlements across the upper Midwest, carrying detailed construction specifications and preservation data that enabled systematic adoption of improved methods. By 1890, double wall sawdust insulation became standard practice throughout Scandinavian farming communities, representing one of the most successful transfers of traditional knowledge to American frontier conditions. The generational impact became apparent as children who learned Norwegian techniques grew into adulthood and established their own homesteads using thermal engineering principles that their parents had initially dismissed as foreign overcaution. The University of Minnesota Agricultural Extension Program incorporated Haugen's methods into official recommendations for frontier construction, creating institutional support that ensured continued development and refinement of Scandinavian techniques adapted to American conditions. Modern recognition of Haugen's achievement culminated in the restoration of his original ice house at the Cass County Historical Museum, where park interpreter Linda Bergstrom explains to contemporary visitors that this wasn't advanced technology, it was applied physics. Niels Haugen understood heat transfer better than most engineers of his time because survival in Norway required that knowledge. The preserved structure serves as tangible evidence that traditional wisdom, properly applied, could solve survival challenges that defeated conventional frontier methods. The final accounting of Haugen's impact reveals success measured in both technical achievement and human survival. His ice house construction cost $73 initially, with $12 annual maintenance, achieving 99.2% ice retention through extreme heat that destroyed conventional preservation systems. The community impact included 11 lives saved from dairy-related illness and prevention of the 1884 typhoid outbreak that devastated neighboring counties without adequate food preservation. Most significantly, the knowledge legacy spread across 3 states, providing construction methods documented and preserved for future generations facing similar survival challenges. The same sawmill that supplied sawdust for insulating cabin walls also provided the cooling power that kept families alive, proving that survival on the frontier required understanding nature's principles rather than fighting them. Traditional knowledge, dismissed as Old World overcaution, proved precisely calibrated for New World extremes, vindicating the patient wisdom of immigrants who understood that extreme environments demanded proven methods rather than hopeful improvisation.